Holmes, professor of history in several universities in the States and even here in Jerusalem. And very much I would like also to introduce ourselves. My name is Joseph Aide. I am the chairman of the Arab Tourist Guides Union in Jerusalem, that we have around 220 members from East Jerusalem and the West Bank. And also we have friends and members from Galilee, from Nazareth, and from other places all over the country. They are all members of the Guides Union. And now with this pandemic, that we have plenty of time to enjoy also not only all the negative things of the coronavirus, but also we have positive things like learning more, having more time with the family and things like that. But most important thing is to listen to several guests that we have and we will have in the future. And we had lecturers from all over the world and also from our country. So we would like, and I already sent some information about you to all the guides, so they know you since half an hour. They already read things about you. So, but the most important thing that all guides, or almost all those who are listening today, they speak English, and we need some time for questions later on. At the time of the lecture, everybody will be muted, but people can send their questions through chat, and Omar at the end of the lecture will say it loud so everybody can hear and you can answer the question. Welcome, Dr. Holmes. We are all listening to you.
Lynn, you need to unmute yourself. I'm sending you an invitation.
Okay. I did?
Yes. Yes, we hear you.
Okay. So I should get started now?
Yes, you can start now. Thank you.
Very good. Let me say it's a special pleasure to speak to you today, to all of you. I have, in the past 52 years, brought a good many groups to the Holy Land and have used many guides and had great appreciation for guides. So, and the knowledge that you folks have. And so I commend you for what you do. And I have been very impressed with the types of things that you do. I hope that I can share with you today some information that will be helpful to you. And if there is other information at other times that I can share, I'll be happy to do that as well. I am by profession an ancient historian. My MA, and I have an MA and a PhD in ancient history and ancient linguistics from Brandeis University in Massachusetts. I also studied for a year in the history and archaeology area at the Hebrew University. And I spent many years teaching history, particularly ancient history, but also modern Middle Eastern history. As I was explaining to Joseph, I feel very much at home in the city of Jerusalem and among the Palestinians. My wife is a Palestinian. Naim Atik, excuse me, is her uncle. And Naim actually performed our wedding ceremony 52 years ago. So I feel very close to the Palestinians and feel like I'm at least part Palestinian myself. My wife and I have 3 daughters, and they are half Palestinians. So we are very close to Palestinians and spend a lot of time with Palestinian people. And we come back to the Middle East frequently. I think I've made somewhere between 40 and 50 trips there, and probably lived in Jerusalem for, if you put all the times together, probably 2 years. So it's a pleasure for me to speak to you and to share information with you. What Omar asked me to do was to really talk with you about two things this morning. One, how did I get involved and where I would want to teach ancient history? How did I get interested in ancient history? And two, to give you kind of a brief synopsis, an overview of the ancient world and how it is related to the Holy Land. This will just be very, very brief, but I'll be happy to answer specific questions that you have in relationship to this. First, let me say I grew up in rural South Georgia. I was in the woods and in the swamps hunting and fishing as a kid. And the possibilities of being a professor was something that did not cross my mind at all. I was interested in having fun. I did get involved in a church and became very interested in religion and particularly became interested in the Old Testament. This caused me to go to not only to get a bachelor's degree in history, but also to go to a seminary and get a master's degree basically in Old Testament studies, and then to go beyond that and to get a doctoral degree in particularly archaeology, ancient history, Old Testament studies, and linguistics, all of the ancient languages. I also studied at the Hebrew University, and particularly studied Egyptology there under Professor Sarah Grohl, but I studied under other professors as well. But my real interest came from being in relationship to school. I remember my first interest in the Middle East really came when I was in the 4th grade, and I was fascinated with the pyramids and with how the Egyptians were able to build them. And then I also was interested in some of the other things that were happening in the ancient world. This interest continued from a religious standpoint in relation to the Old Testament. And then as I went away to school at a seminary, I became even more interested in ancient history and archaeology, and actually then went on to Brandeis University, where I majored in these things and then taught ancient history and modern Middle Eastern history for about 36 years, as well as was an administrator in colleges and universities for that same period of time. I've been retired about 15 years and have enjoyed my retirement doing all kinds of things. One of the things I did was at Naim Atik's request, I came in 2006 and was the coordinator of a Sabile International Conference of that year. And my wife and I were there for 2 months doing that. And it was really an awful lot of fun. But so much for all of that. Let me now just give you a brief overview of the ancient world, and then leave plenty of time for you to ask your questions. One of the things that I think we need to do is to realize just how important history is. And many times people say, why should I worry about the ancient world? It has nothing to do with me. Well, it does. It has everything to do with you, because history is a study of the actions and lives and the accomplishments and failures of people all over the world. The starting of history, of human history, is scattered in many places in what we can call the Old Stone Age, which is from about 4 million years ago down to about 12,000 years ago. The Middle Stone Age, or Mesolithic period, which is from about 12,000 years ago to 8,000 years ago. Well, excuse me, 8,000 BC. And then the New Stone Age or Neolithic period from about 8,000 to 4,000 BC. Those were Stone Ages, and people used the concept of the Stone Ages in large part because of the tools that people used. The accomplishments of men many times were judged based on their tools and their weapons. And in the Stone Ages, it was all stone. And when you say Paleolithic or Mesolithic or Neolithic, the last part of that, lithic, is the Greek term for stone. And so it's the Paleo is old, so it's the old Stone Age. Meso is middle Stone Age, Neo, new Stone Age. So you have the Stone Ages. The most important of these Stone Ages is really the Neolithic period. And during that period of time, a very, very important thing takes place, and it's called the Agricultural Revolution. The Agricultural Revolution was when people began to domesticate plants and animals. Before then, they had been hunters and gatherers. But with the domestication of plants and animals, they could settle in one place. They could develop towns. They could live together. You could have the sharing of their work. There could become specialties in certain areas. And as they did so, then they began to have to develop ways to live together. And so this involved governments. This involved legal structures. This involved architecture. And along the way, art came in. And then also you had people learning that they could take things from others. So you began to have the development of wars among people. So all of the basic things that people deal with today, these folks dealt with. I used to tell my students, do you know what the greatest problem of ancient man was? And they would usually not know, but the greatest problem was getting along with other people. How do you deal with getting along with other people? What's the greatest problem we have today? Same one. From a standpoint of getting along with other people, man has had in the past 20,000 years, zero success. And this is one of the most important things. We haven't learned the lessons of the past. And some of the writers in relationship to history have said, if we don't know history, then we continue to make the same mistakes that our forebears made. There's so much to learn from history. Many times I predict on the basis of historical things. And it's amazing how correct you can be with your predictions by looking to the past, seeing what happened, and realizing probably the same thing is going to happen again because people are doing exactly the same thing that they did 200 or 500 or 700 years ago. And people basically are creatures that do the same thing. And too frequently, they don't learn from the lessons of the past. But anyway, in this agricultural revolution, man changed a great deal. These agricultural revolutions really took place mainly along the rivers of the ancient world. And I'll just say a few things briefly outside the Middle East, but most of them took place in the Middle East, particularly along the Nile River and along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. But at the same time that they were going on in those areas, 6,000, 8,000 years ago, they were also going on in India along the Indus River, as well as in China along the Yangtze River. It wasn't that the Middle East was the only place where this was taking place. It was happening all along, or in many places in the world, along the river's banks. So one of the periods that we have is called the Riverine civilization period. And this is basically from about 4000 BC up to 2000 BC. And this is where people are beginning to settle along the banks of the rivers and beginning to develop their cultures. After this particular period of time, you can say that there was a period called the Imperial Period, which lasted from approximately 2000 BC down to about 1200 BC. And this was a period when you had big empires developing. One, of course, was the Egyptian Empire. Another is one that people are less familiar with, but one that was a very great empire, and this was the Hittite Empire. It was centered in around what is the modern area of Bogazkoy, which is in north central Turkey, but it was called Hattusas. And it was a very big empire and a very powerful empire. Another one was the Hyksos, Hyksos Empire, which actually developed in the steppes of Russia, and they developed chariots. They were the first ones to develop chariots and to use horses. And they actually conquered Egypt and controlled Egypt for about 200 years before the Egyptians were finally able to run them out. So these were big empires that were very important. After this period of time, we have what we can call the Age of Chaos. And this was a very bad period. This is the period of time you may have heard of a group of people called the Sea Peoples. This period of time took place between 1200 BC and 1100 BC. And it was a time when a group of people probably were forced out of the Greek Isles and maybe from the southern part of Greece by an invading group that came from the north into Greece, a group of people called the Dorians. And these Sea Peoples began to move to the east, and they basically destroyed everything in their path. They destroyed the Hittite Empire. They destroyed all of the kingdoms in Syria and what is now Lebanon. They destroyed the areas around what is now modern Israel and came to the very border of Egypt and almost conquered Egypt. The Egyptian kings fought against them. I think it was Ramses II, and was finally able to stop them from coming on into Egypt. The king claimed great victory, but Egypt never recuperated from the Sea Peoples being there. I should mention to you, there's one part of the Sea Peoples that you're very familiar with, and you probably were not aware they were part of the Sea Peoples. This is the Philistines. The Philistines were not Semites. They were basically of Greek origin or Mediterranean origin. And of course, they stayed in the area of the Southern Holy Land for many years before they were finally destroyed. But anyway, this period of chaos made many changes in the Middle East. For one thing, it basically caused a power vacuum. Before this time, the powers in the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley or in the Egyptian River Valley had been in control over all of the Middle East. Now all of those were weak. And as a result, we had what is called the Age of Minor Kingdoms. These are minor kingdoms like the Mitanni, the Canaanites, the Phoenicians, the Arameans, and the Hebrews. And this was a brief period of time when there was not a strong power that controlled these areas, and they could do some of the things on their own. It was not long after this, however, starting about 850 and lasting until 333, that you had what is called many times the Great Imperial Period. And during this period, you had the rise of the Assyrian, the Chaldean, and the Persian empires. and they were very, very powerful, and they controlled the whole Middle East. Though many times people think that the Hebrew kingdom was very strong for a long period of time, it was not. It was a very brief period of time. And during the period of this great imperial time, the only way the Hebrew kingdom was able to stay in existence was to pay tribute to whoever was in control in Egypt or whoever was in control in the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley. One of the kings in the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, Shalmaneser III, actually has a big obelisk in which he has, one of the parts of it is a representative of the Hebrew king Jehu bowing down before him, bringing his tribute to the king to make certain the king wouldn't come and conquer the country. So this period lasted for a while, and then in 333, you begin to have the coming of the Greeks. Alexander the Great, about 333, moved into the Middle East, conquered the Middle East, and even though his life was very short, he left a very strong presence there. And the generals that he had after Alexander's death, they then seized, each one of them seized part of the country. General Seleucus set up the Seleucid Empire in Turkey and Syria and sometimes Israel. And another general by the name of Ptolemy set up the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt, which also controlled part of the Holy Land as well. This period of time saw a lot of confusion. It also was the time too where you had the Hebrews rising up against particularly the Greek rulers that were there. And this was the time of the Hasmonean Kingdom, which lasted from about 165 to 63 BC. In 63 BC, everything changed once again. When Pompey the Great, the Roman ruler, came in, he took control pretty much of everything in the Middle East and moved on down. Egypt was taken as well, and the Romans controlled that area basically from about 63 BC to approximately 400 AD. The Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantine Empire, continued to control it for several hundred more years before it came to an end. This is just a very rapid coverage of the ancient Middle East. And at this point, Omar, I will stop, and I'll be happy to try to answer any questions related to these things or to other things that the guides may be interested in.
Thank you very much. It's an excellent introduction, and I'm sure that many of the guides are aware of many facts. And now I think that the beauty of this lecture will be in the questions that will be addressed. So guides can ask the questions if they would like to write it in Arabic, if it's easier to type and I can translate, or we can write it in, you can write it in English. So, I mean, that's a general question, and I don't know if you have the answer for it. Where is the body of Alexander the Great buried in?
I'm not certain that anyone really knows. He died in a military campaign, actually, probably in Pakistan. He was wounded badly and died, and as they were returning towards Greece. And it's like with many of the saints in Christianity, there are too frequently many places where they were buried, and you really don't know which one was the right one. So I'm really not certain where Alexander is. I'm not certain where his body is. I'm not certain that anyone knows.
Please tell us more about the Hebrew kingdoms.
What would they like to know about the Hebrew kingdoms?
Some people are saying maybe it's easier if we open the mics and people ask questions. They're having problems in writing the questions. And I think it's fine if we keep it as questions. So.
However, it's fine with me, Omar.
Okay, so we could.
Hello.
Yes, Salah.
Yeah. Hello, this is Salah speaking. Sir, first, thank you for the general introduction for the lecture. And I would like to ask, from your perspective, do you consider the Bible as a source of knowledge for the archaeology in the Holy Land, or do you think the science is the source of the knowledge? Thank you.
Thank you, Salah.
It's basically a combination of the two. There are many things that the Bible does not tell you. In fact, many times it tells you very little about a lot of things. The science fills in the gaps many times, particularly archaeology or the work of linguists, ancient linguists who are dealing with the documents, either the scrolls or cuneiform tablets or Egyptian script or the ancient Canaanite scripts. All of these things fill in for that.
And why Jericho is the oldest city in the world?
Jericho is considered probably the oldest city. There is some that contest that. There are other cities that are very old. Jarmo in the area of Kurdistan is also a very, very old city. Çatalhöyük, which is in Turkey, is a very old city. And many times it's basically who's doing the talking as to which city is the oldest. I kind of favor Jericho because I like Jericho and I enjoy going there and wandering around on the tell. But it's very, very hard to know. One of the things that you must always keep in mind when you deal with ancient things is it can change very quickly. I remember when I was a beginning professor teaching ancient history, some of my colleagues that taught European history and American history said, you folks are so fortunate that teach ancient history because it never changes. Well, these folks didn't know what they were talking about, because with ancient history, somebody can overturn a shovel of dirt and find something that will change 1,000 years of history overnight. So we don't know so many things, and so many things get changed very, very rapidly by the archaeological discoveries that are made. It's just like, well, one that you're very familiar with are the Qumran Scrolls. No one knew they existed until the Bedouin person found some of the scrolls, and then everybody started looking for them. And then all of a sudden that changed much. Now, the key thing that came out of that was that we learned about a group of people called, basically scribes, and the people around Qumran became zealots. The people also wrote things, and they would copy the text and then hide it, mainly so the Romans wouldn't find it. And so you had all of this as the Essenes did their work there in Qumran and probably in some other places too. So there's so many discoveries that happen on a continual basis that you always have to be aware of what is happening or what the archaeologists are doing, because they basically change some parts of history every year.
Was it the pharaohs that managed to kick the Hyksos out of Egypt?
Yes, several of the pharaohs worked on the Hyksos. They didn't like having foreign people controlling them, but the military forces of Egypt were very, very weak. To begin with, they didn't have modern and sophisticated stuff until the Hyksos came in, and the Hyksos taught them about the chariots, taught them about certain kinds of bows, taught them how to use animals in warfare, and this helped the Egyptians considerably and enabled them to run the Hyksos out. But it took 200 years to do it. So it was not one of those things that was done rapidly. But Egypt went through periods where it was strong and then other periods that it was weak. But this is true of almost every country where they have ups and downs, and the Egyptians were certainly part of that. I should mention to you too that what I tried to explain to my students was that history, particularly ancient history, is very much like a jigsaw puzzle, where you have a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. And what you have is you don't have all the pieces. And it varies with the time period as to how many pieces you have. Like in modern history, modern times, you'll have, of the 1,000 pieces, sometimes you'll have 990 of the pieces. When you deal with the Stone Ages, you will have probably 5 pieces and you'll have 995 missing. And so many periods of time we have meager information on just because we do not have the things to give us the information we need. So we are searching for that information. And in relationship, to the Bible and science, the Bible has helped some, and science has helped a lot in relationship to understanding what really happened in these historical periods.
How solid is the claim that the Philistines are the sea people?
It's very solid. It's clear they were part of the Sea Peoples movement. There were many people, they were actually called Peliset. They were part of this group. There were the Tejeker, there were the Nuna, there were the Mekwesh and the Ekwesh. There were the other groups that took place in that, but the ones that stayed in the Holy Land, and probably some of these others joined them, were the Philistines. And of course, their name got changed from Peliset to Philistines by later generations. But it's clear they did not speak the Semitic languages. They spoke a Greek-oriented language. They had science that the other people did not have, particularly they had iron. They knew how to smelt iron, how to get iron out, and to make better weapons than the people around them had. And the Hebrews learned a great deal from the Philistines. In fact, if you remember, and people forget this, it's in the biblical text, but David, before he became king, he basically worked for the Philistines. He and his group that he had of ruffians basically signed up to be mercenary soldiers for the Philistines and help them on certain things until the Philistines decided that they might not be as loyal to them as they thought, and they got rid of them. But David learned a lot of things from the Philistines himself because he actually worked for them for a while.
As a professor in Old Testament history, can you please explain to us how do we get away with the Old Testament using the same gods of the ancient Canaanites?
One of the big mistakes that people make is to think that the Hebrews were always monotheistic. They were not. Most of the time, they were at least partially polytheistic. If you will look through the pages of the Old Testament, you will find on virtually every page that somebody was condemning the Hebrews because they were worshiping some pagan gods. Even David had a pagan statue in his home. And many of the leaders did. At one time, I believe it was during the reign of Josiah, Josiah had to cleanse the temple. And a part of the cleansing of the temple was getting rid of all of the pagan statuary and pagan deities that were there. There were pagan shrines on virtually every hill where the Hebrews were. You have to understand that the Hebrews were basically agricultural people. The Hebrew God was not so much an agricultural God. Who had the agricultural God? The Canaanites. And when the Hebrews first came in to the land of Canaan, they had been in the desert. They didn't know anything about farming. They learned from the Canaanites. And one of the things they learned from the Canaanites was that the Canaanite fertility gods helped the Canaanites grow good crops. And so the Hebrews had the Canaanite fertility deities all around. So seldom were they really totally monotheistic. And it was a continual matter for the royal household, which strictly itself was not monotheistic, to try to keep people straight. And the prophets were always working on that because the Hebrews were not very monotheistic at all.
According to some theory, the Hyksos may have been the Hebrews, not people from Russia. How sure are we about the origin of the Hyksos?
Pretty sure about that, and for certain the Hebrews were not part of it. I have never heard that theory, so I'm not certain where that came from. But the Hyksos did not speak a Semitic language. They were probably more of an Indo-European group. There are two major language groups in the Middle East, and one is the Semitic language group, and the other is the Indo-European language group. And the Hyksos, I think, were a part of that Indo-European language group, as were the Hittites, as were some other groups, as are the modern Iranians. The language of Iran, Farsi, is much closer to English than it is to Hebrew or to Arabic. Though it's written in Arabic, it is an Indo-European language. It is not a Semitic language at all. So I don't think there's any credibility. I've never seen anything ever written that the Hebrews were a part of this group. They were from somewhere else, that they came in and they took over things. And that was not unusual. The area along the eastern Mediterranean shoreline was an area that was continually blessed or cursed by people coming from other parts of the world, going north and south and east and west. And so there was a continual movement of people through that area, and not always a lot of stability there.
In your opinion, how credible are the stories of the Old Testament, especially those vicious battles like the Battle of Joshua and Jericho and the story of Sodom and Gomorrah? And do you think that these events were over-exaggerated?
So much of the belief in the historicity or the historical value of the Old Testament is dependent on how religious a person is and how much support they want to give to the Old Testament. The Hebrews wrote things that they enjoyed reading. And so sometimes there are big question marks about the historical value of them, and particularly the scientific value of them. And so there are many question marks about this as to exactly what these things mean and the value of these things. It's just like in today's world, many times people are willing to believe stories that are totally incorrect rather than stories that are correct. You can get an awful lot of followers believing things like that. If you want to see a very good case of that, you can look at the United States and what's happening here with some of the things that are going on. So people will buy in to theories on almost anything if they like the sound of it.
So according to you and your opinion, which era of history was the most effective and important one, and why?
That's an exceptionally difficult question to answer. Every period of history has value to it and makes some degree of contributions to it. Every period of history makes tragic mistakes and causes all kinds of problems. So it's very, very problematic. You would have to determine, what do you put value on? Is value on science? Is it on literature? Is it on art? Is it on architecture? Is it on philosophy? And this is what you would have to look at to see, because each period made contributions as well as each period, had problems. And there were certain periods that contributed a lot in certain areas, but not in others. In fact, just to give you a case in point, what contributions did the Hebrews make to civilization? They were abominable architects. They were abominable makers of almost anything. They had all kinds of problems. The key thing they did was to write a book on religion that people have found of value. If you think about the temple itself in Jerusalem, the Solomonic temple, who built the Solomonic temple? It wasn't the Hebrews. Actually, Solomon hired Hiram of Tyre to bring his workers and to bring the wood and other stuff to build the temple in Jerusalem. And all of the holy things that were in the temple were not made by Hebrews. They were made by the people of Tyre and then put in the temple. So architecturally and militarily, except for the reign of David, which was short-lived, the Hebrews were not involved and made great contributions. What they're remembered for is the Old Testament and the teachings that are there.
There is some proof in the Bible that the Philistines were present in the mid-Bronze Age, and we know about the covenant of Abraham and Abimelech. But you mentioned their presence in late Bronze Age, 12th to 11th century BC. Are mid and late Bronze Age Philistines the same people?
Well, the late Bronze Age comes down to about 1200 or so. So the Hebrews were certainly, by 1200, they were in the Holy Land by that period of time.
May I ask where Joshua ben Nun is buried and what was his age when he died?
Once again, I do not know where he was buried, and I do not know his age. I'm not even certain that it is mentioned in the Bible. And if it's not mentioned in the Bible, there may be some story of that, but I'm not certain exactly where it was. One of the interesting things to me was there are stories about biblical people going and dying in all kinds of parts of the world. I spent a good bit of time in the former Soviet state of Uzbekistan in Central Asia and traveled all over the country, did a lot of work there. And I went to one place which was supposed to be the shrine and the burial place of Jonah. Now, how did Jonah get to Central Asia? I don't know. But this is a place, and it's considered a holy place, even by the Muslims that live in Uzbekistan. It's predominantly a Muslim population, in fact, almost totally Muslim population. Excuse me. But there are places all around the world how many burial places are there for Mary? How many burial places are there for various kings and various leaders, various prophets? You find many of them, many places, and basically nobody really knows on these particular things. They're just traditions that circulate.
Who are the Habiros?
Habiru?
Habiros, yes.
The Habiru, many times people connect them with Hebrews, and they may be. They were basically nomadic peoples, and of course the Hebrews were nomadic peoples that traveled around in many places in the ancient world. But they're mentioned in a number of different areas, but they're basically Bedouin. And like I said, the Hebrews were Bedouin. The Hebrews traveled a lot. They came out of what is called Ur of the Chaldees, which is at the southernmost part of what is now modern Iraq. And they moved from there up the Euphrates River to a place called Aram Naharaim, which is means in the bend of the river, which is in northern Syria. And then they moved into Canaan and wandered around for years until they then went during the time of Joseph to Egypt. So they moved around, and so many people connect the terms Habiru and Hebrew, whether they are the same people or whether Habiru is more of a catch-all term for Bedouin is difficult to know. It's debated.
This is a follow-up to the question of mixing Hebrew God, the Hebrew God with the Canaanite God. Further to my question about the Old Testament gods, how do we explain the New Testament with Jesus referring to himself as Yahuwah, which is most probably a Median God?
Tell me that again now. I'm not understanding it exactly.
How do we explain the New Testament with Jesus when Jesus refers to himself as Yahweh, which is most probably a Median God?
How do you spell that?
M-E-D-I-A-N.
What?
M-E-D-I-A-N.
M-E-D-I-A-N, Median. Where does Jesus do this?
I'm not sure if Jesus referred as Yahuwah, so I don't know. We'll open it for the person to ask this question later on. Here's another question. According to the genetic diagram of the last Philistine cemetery discovered near Ashkelon, these people had over 90% of their genes as Persian and Levant, and from the Levant. Do you think they were simply a more developed group rather than a foreign group of the area, to the area?
All of the indications from a biblical text and from the archaeological things that I have looked at, they were definitely a Mediterranean group that moved in and then stayed in that particular area. I'm not familiar with studies that point to a more Levant group being there, unless it would have been at a much later period of time than the Philistines.
What about the Palestinians during the time of Abraham?
The Palestinians?
Yes.
There were no such thing as Palestinians during the time of Abraham. There were Canaanites.
Yes.
The Palestinians did not come into existence really until a much later period of time. Of course, the word Palestine actually comes from the Philistines or the Peliset. And it was picked up, I think, during the Byzantine rule and applied to that particular area that became called Palestine. But there were no real Palestinians until a much, much later period of time, and certainly not in Old Testament times. Now, there were Canaanites, and one could indeed say that the Palestinian ancestors were Canaanites. But once again, you can go on that, do all kinds of things with it. I was very interested one time. This was in 1974, and I invited, I was teaching a class on the modern Middle East, and I invited all kinds of people or all kinds of groups to send representatives, particularly Arab groups and Jewish groups. And I had a number to come. I had some people to come from the Israeli embassy, one from the Israeli consulate, had somebody to come from the Arab League, and I had someone to come from the PLO. And the guy from the PLO was a most interesting guy, a very, very good speaker and propagandist. And I was fascinated in one of the things that he said. He said, you know, Golda Meir, she was from Russia and then came to the US. He said, I probably have more Jewish blood in me than Golda Meir did. And he was probably right, because if you check your DNA with some of these agencies, you'll find probably many of you have some Jewish blood in you. People mix. And so it's hard to know many of these things as to what you want to call them and how you want to call them. What we generally do is people that live in certain geographical areas are called people from that geographical area. So I live in the US, so I'm an American. If I lived somewhere else, I could be exactly the same person. I would be, if I lived in France and had grown up in France, though I had the same DNA I have right now, I would be I would be French. But I think the geographical thing is the thing that puts the name on people more than anything else. But like I said, the Palestinians did not exist until much later times. There were no such people as that. They were probably originally Canaanites. Many of the Hebrews were originally Canaanites, because if you remember in the Old Testament, the Hebrews conquered some of the Canaanite groups, and then they intermarried with them. Sometimes they killed them off, but a lot of times they just intermarried with them. And so you had the bloodlines of these people mixing there.
So one of the guides has given us a reference saying, if you check Genesis chapter 21, verse 34, it ends with this: and Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines for a long time.
I think many times in relationship to something like that, it could be a different group of people, or it could be that the writers added it without it being totally accurate. Like I said, everything that I have read and everything I have seen in relationship to the Philistines was that there were no Philistines there until around 1200 or so. But once again, there may have been a group of people that had a similar type of name that were called that, and then later writers changed it and made it fit in with the Philistines. I do not know. I'll have to go back and look at that particular reference.
How do you explain that the ancient nations do not exist in our days except the Jews? I'm not sure the ancient, because it's the Egyptians still exist. I mean, the Copts and
yeah. Well, the Persians still exist.
The Chaldeans, the Syrians.
So the Syrians still exist. Yeah. Though the Lebanese want to call themselves Phoenicians, they're not, but they're just Arabs and Syrians, because I think most of you are aware that the country of Lebanon was the French, when they took over a mandate of Syria, just like the Egyptian, just like the British, when they took over the mandate of Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq in 1918 to 1920, they controlled and did what they wanted to with it. And the French carved out of Syria the country of Lebanon. It was Syria up until about 1922 or 1923, when the French carved it out. But many of the people in Lebanon want to call themselves Phoenician. The Phoenicians died out a long time ago. The people of Lebanon are a mixture of cultures, just like the Palestinians are, all of the people that travel through that particular area. So, it's hard to know with some of these people.
Did you think that the Jews today or in these days belong to the same Jewish people in the Old Testament, sons of Israel?
Probably not. Once again, I think if you check the DNA on people, you will find that there is much more European DNA in most of the Jews in the modern state of Israel than there is Middle Eastern or Jewish blood. And just as, like I said, also probably a high percentage of the Palestinians have some degree of Jewish blood in them. My wife had her DNA checked, and indeed, part of her was Jewish. So it's not unusual for that kind of thing to happen. People living in the same area tend to intermarry. Do Jews and Palestinians marry today? Of course they do. And every place in the world, you have cultures that are mixing. Of course, places like the United States and Canada are the biggest examples of it. And we're called basically a melting pot from a standpoint of people mixing their cultures and mixing their DNA. But I think pure-blooded people of one culture or another right now are exceptionally difficult, except in areas where there's very little contact with the outside world.
Can we say that ancient Egypt was the largest and most developed civilization of all times, judging by the large amounts of artifacts that were discovered and are still being discovered nowadays?
There were many things there, but there were also many things in other cultures as well. Egypt was blessed. So many things are preserved in Egypt because of the dry climate. There may have been as much or more in the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, but it is much wetter. It has much more humidity. And the result is that so many things are easily destroyed in that particular culture. But the Egyptians did some wonderful things. And of course, there are all kinds of debates about how the Egyptians were able to do all of those things. One of the things that amazes me about the Egyptians is if you go to the Great Pyramid, several million stone blocks in it, and 400 and something feet high. And I think geometrically, it is an inch or a fraction of an inch off. We can't build anything that accurately today. So it's amazing at what they did. This is why so many people, there's a writer by the name of Van Daniken, who wrote a lot of things, and others that followed up writing similar types of things, say that the Egyptians were able to do what they did because of aliens that came from outside our universe or outside our system and taught the Egyptians how to do the things they did. Otherwise, they could not have scientifically and architecturally done many of the things that they did. But there were great things that were being done in, like I said, in the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, in the Indus River Valley, and in the Yangtze River Valley that were really great. But there is more evidence left of it, the great things they did in Egypt than any other place. This you can't say for certain.
I heard that new studies claim that Jericho never had walls. So the story that Joshua put down the walls of Jericho is not true. Do you know anything about this?
Well, it's clear that there were some walls at Jericho. In fact, there were walls very, very early and watchtowers very early. One of the earliest structures in Jericho is that watchtower that was excavated there in Jericho. It is, it's from about 7,000 years ago. Yeah, around 7,000 years ago. It's been there a long, long time. long before you would have Joshua coming through there. But there were walls that were there. Whether there were the walls during the time of Joshua or not, that's hard to know. Whether Joshua marched around and the walls came tumbling down, once again, there's no way to prove that or to disprove that, because there's just not evidence one way or the other on it. So much of it centers around, what you want to believe and what type of accuracy you apply to scientific types of things and architectural things that are mentioned in the biblical text. And so much of it depends on your religious concepts related to it. But we really don't know for certain. There are definitely walls at Jericho, but most of the walls come from times earlier than the time of Joshua. Whether there was a wall there at the time of Joshua, once again, it's very hard to know.
Do you think that today's Jews are share one ethnicity? And if yes, how do you explain Jews spread among a various number of origins and continents?
I don't think Jews at all come from the same ethnicity. I think they're a mixture of people, just like I'm a mixture of people. I come from many different society or many different ethnic groups. My children come from even more ethnic groups because of my wife, and she's connected to, of course, she has Arab ancestry. Her family is also part Armenian, and she's got some other things in there as well. I've got a whole mixture of stuff as well in me. So I think people are mixed up from a standpoint of their ethnicity. It's only in areas where people are separated from others that you don't have the mixing of them. You cannot tell me that the Jews that come out of Ethiopia, who are dark-skinned and who have a totally different type of Judaism from the Jews that came out of Europe and that came out of the Middle East, are exactly the same ethnicity as those Jews. No, I think this is just a whole mixture of people. And wherever the Jews went, they intermarried with other people, and they kept the religion, but they didn't keep the ethnic purity there. And so I don't think there's one ethnicity at all.
One final question. Do we know the names of the most famous leaders of the Sea People?
No, we do not. We know the groups, but none of the leaders are mentioned. But there were a vast number of groups that came down together and destroyed. The most famous place they destroyed was the city of Troy. Many times people think that the writings in relationship to the city of Troy were fictitious, but they have now discovered the city of Troy and have excavated the city of Troy. And it was one of the cities that was destroyed by the Sea People. Whenever they came through, they destroyed everything.
I think we had some people who wanted to ask questions. Orally, not writing them down. I don't know if George is with us. If you want us to open the mic, please just put your hand up. Then I think that's it, Abu Simon.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Holmes. Really, it was interesting listening to you with all the information that you gave us. We very much appreciate this lecture, and we hope that we can invite you again in the near future. And I also would like very much to thank Omar from Sabil. And I don't know if Pastor Naim is still with us for this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It was a pleasure speaking to you. And if I can provide other information on some things, I'll be happy to try to do so. Just tell Omar to let me know, and we'll try to work something out. But it's a pleasure speaking to you. And I wish to all of you that the virus will soon be done away with, that the vaccines will be good and will make everyone able to go wherever they want, whenever they want, and to make the planes where they will come back and the hotels will be full and the buses will be full and you'll have plenty of business and make plenty of money. So wish you the very best of luck on that.
Thank you.
And definitely that
On behalf of everybody
comes to
thank you.
destroy to destroy everything that everybody already knows.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Inshallah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Omar. Enjoyed working with you on this. It's been, what, 16 years, no, 14 years since I worked with you. So it's good to do it again.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you.
Please give my regards to your family.
I will, inshallah.
Okay. Well, I'll sign off then. I hope I covered what you wanted me to cover, Omar.
Yes, it's excellent. I mean, it is, of course, we cannot go into depth in every civilization. We need maybe like 4 or 5 lectures, the minimum, to go into the Egyptian civilization and to go into.
Yeah. Well, a lot of interesting things in Egypt. You're right.
May I add, can you hear me?
Yeah.
May I add my thanks to Lynn? Thank you so much. It was wonderful. I learned a lot.